Hello and welcome to class, everybody. What we are going to do today for sections 2 and 3 for our lecture notes, I'm going to combine them into one lecture because they are two fairly short sections. So just as always, if you need to pause, rewind, and go back at any point, please do so. Use these notes and the lecture to fill out the lecture guide, and you will be able to use that on your guided reading and along with the quiz that will be coming up for your section. So if there's any other questions as you go through, make sure you raise your hand and I will come around and assist you. Otherwise, we may begin. So last video lecture we were discussing some of the changes that the 1920s brought as far as racial things were concerned, as far as the fear of immigrants, there was a fear of communists, and there was ways that the United States was dealing with that. Also, though, there was an independence given to women, and women were becoming increasingly more independent and having different types of structure in society. What we're going to be moving on into today is some of the cultural changes that the 1920s brought on, and also what kind of changes were made towards any kind of minority groups, such as African Americans at this point. So there was a lot of famous writers and poets that really come to become, well, I guess very popular, you could say, during the 1920s. And a couple that I would like to note as we go through would be Carl Sandburg. He was one that was more of an orator. He used common speech, and in a lot of his publications he created, he always glorified the Midwest, since he was a Midwest man himself. Willa Cather, on the other hand, wrote about life on the Great Plains in her literature works. Ernest Hemingway, many people know, he was a very, very famous writer. He experienced so much fame and fortune for his writings. Some of his very famous war books that he created is For Whom the Bell Tolls, which Metallica has a song based off that, and A Farewell to Arms, very great war books. Then we have Sinclair Lewis, who wrote about the absurdities of small-town life in a book called Main Street and Babbitt. F. Scott Fitzgerald, many of you may have read The Great Gatsby. It was a book that pretty much epitomized what the 1920s were all about and modern society's superficiality. So a lot of schools are required to read that today, and that might be a book you might have had to read. Edith Wharton, The Age of Innocence. It criticized upper-class ignorance and pretensions, basically made fun of the rich people. So millions of Americans, now that they have all this leisure time, they're able to enjoy more things. And in addition to literature and writing and poetry, people were watching more sports, and a lot more sports were being created during this time. Also, people were enjoying music, they were enjoying theater, radio became very popular once it's invented. In 1927, you see the first talking picture, basically your first movie that you could see at a movie theater is released, and it was called The Jazz Singer. And if you'd like to look it up on YouTube, you can search it on YouTube. On radio, there was a show called Amos and Andy, and it's about two African Americans. But back then, African Americans weren't allowed to be in a lot of theater productions, so they were always portrayed by white actors in blackface. Sports. Baseball and boxing gained popularity through the radio. People can listen in onto the live sporting events. College football, golf, and tennis gained popularity through newspaper coverage, so sports become part of American culture. They're increasingly more popular. And after you have the note guide done for this, actually, that brings you to the end of the first section. And our next section is going to be focusing more on African American culture. And one big event that happens during the 1920s for African Americans is called the Harlem Renaissance. Because all the African American populations start migrating to the northern cities, you're going to see more neighborhoods for African Americans in larger cities. And one of the more famous ones is Harlem in New York. And it becomes the center of what they call the African American Renaissance. The Harlem Renaissance, as its nickname is given, is a flowering of African American arts. African Americans become increasingly more creative with music stylings and different artistic portraits. There's going to be so much different art that comes out of this time. A lot of famous African American writers would include Claude McKay, and the poems including The Lynching. And those were significant because they expressed the proud defiance and the bitter contempt of racism that had been going on at that point. Langston Hughes became a leading voice of African American experience. And Zora Neale Hurston. Her novels were the first to feature African American women as central characters. Jazz, blues, and theater, kind of the main themes here. Louis Armstrong introduces an early form of jazz in 1922. He's kind of like one of the grandfathers, or fathers, I guess you could say, founding fathers of jazz music. Then there was Duke Ellington. He was also a composer of jazz music. He was a pianist, and he was also a band leader of a big jazz band. Cotton Club, where many African American entertainers got their start. The ironic thing, though, is about the Cotton Club is that it served whites only, but African Americans were ones that were entertaining there, especially once blues and jazz became more popular. Now, the difference between the styles of music. Blues is a soulful style of music that evolved from African American spirituals. And you can have the same with jazz as more of the musical styling that accompanies the blues. Bessie Smith is a famous blues singer. She was called the Empress of Blues. Shuffle Along, the first musical written and produced and performed by African Americans. So as you can see, not only is it just the music stylings, there's going to be musicals and theaters created by African Americans during the Harlem Renaissance. African Americans in politics. In northern cities is where you start to see more African Americans getting involved in politics. African Americans become a powerful voting bloc that could sway elections because there is an increasingly large population moving into the northern parts of the country. This new ideology or political thought helped Oscar DePriest, the first African American representative, to be voted into Congress from a northern state. So this is huge and key because before this you don't see as many African Americans being put into political positions. And during the Harlem Renaissance, you see groups and activist groups start to form, and one is the NAACP. The NAACP battles violently against segregation and discrimination, which was still occurring. It also protects against lynching, which was the hanging of African Americans. Anti-lynching legislation passed in the House in 1922, and the Senate defeated the bill. So the Senate wasn't necessarily in approval of the bill. One African American man who made a huge impact during the Harlem Renaissance era of the 1920s is Marcus Garvey. He believed in an idea called Negro nationalism, which glorifies black culture and traditions. He founded a group called the Universal Negro Improvement Association, which was centered around giving African Americans the opportunity to gain economic and political power by educating themselves. Garvey also advocated separation and independence from whites. He didn't think that people should get along. He just thought that African Americans should be trying to separate from the white population. And he proposed a movement to his followers called Back to Africa, which meant literally he wanted the people of the United States, the African American population in the United States, to pick up and move back to Africa. And I believe he wanted to set up a colony in Liberia for all of his followers that left the United States to come back to Africa. So there's going to be some issues when you have these groups becoming powerful like this and some of these leaders. The FBI sees this new organization for African Americans as a dangerous catalyst for black uprisings. And Garvey ends up going to jail for mail fraud. So they were kind of monitoring him for a while, and they found a way to kind of prosecute him. Similar to what happened to Al Capone. They get Garvey for mail fraud. President Coolidge commuted his sentence, and President Coolidge commuted, and his sentence that he received for Garvey was to deport him to Jamaica. He could no longer be a United States resident, but he was allowed to leave the country and live a life just somewhere else. Okay, and that is where we will pause for today, so make sure you fill in your note guide and have everything ready to go for your guided reading so that you're able to do well on the quiz. Any questions, raise your hand. I'll come around and help you out.